Hello and welcome to Fresh and Foraged. I'm your host, Carolyn Dugas, and today we'll be busting out the old microscope to take a peek at how you can get started foraging in 4 easy steps. Now that you're all pumped up after watching 6 reasons that you can become a forager, it's time to buckle up and get down to business. Plant business. Now, to provide a little context, foraging falls on a spectrum. It can range from the wild blueberry enthusiast who wanders out once a year in search of those tasty blue orbs, all the way to someone who forages each and every day for wild foods. Now, wherever you fall on that spectrum, at any point in time, that is great. It's just dandy. You count and you belong. As I've said before, a forager is anyone who collects any plant or mushroom that grows of its own volition, even if that person only likes to collect one species per year. Foraging is fun, and everyone at every stage of their foraging journey is welcome. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's take a peek at how you can get started foraging. Step number 1. Find a place to forage. In my experience, it is a heck of a lot easier to start with a place and learn the plants that are already there than to get your mind stuck on one plant and try and hunt it down, despite its stationary nature. In the beginning, try and focus on what you have physical access to, as opposed to what seems most interesting in the field guide. So how do we find a good place to forage? Well, the first step is figuring out where not to forage. Plants and mushrooms are products of their environment, just like us all, so we're going to want to avoid areas that are polluted or sprayed with pesticides. This includes areas sometimes known as brownfields, which are basically just officially contaminated land. Do yourself a little Google to see if there's any lots that you should avoid harvesting from. Other surprisingly alluring areas to avoid harvesting are along railroad tracks and beneath power lines. Both of these areas are heavily sprayed. If you're not sure if an area has been sprayed, observe it. Come back periodically throughout the season and check in, see if all the plants have mysteriously died all at the same time, which is a sure sign that it's been sprayed. And then you know to avoid that area. So now that we know where not to forage, let's dig into some juicy tidbits and figure out where to find these wild plants. Yards are a wonderful starting place, not just for their delicious weeds, but also because you're less likely to be hassled by passers-by. Now, if you don't happen to have a yard at hand, ask your friends. Foraging is a community endeavor. Ask around and see if anyone will let you roam their lands in exchange for some plants or tasty goods. And if neither of those options are available to you, mosey on down to your local park. Just make sure that you check in with your local foraging regulations, which brings me to number 2. Be mindful of local foraging, or in reality, anti-foraging laws. So humanity has been foraging, also known as the gathering portion of hunting and gathering, basically forever. And it's only recently, within the past few hundred years here in America, that institutional regulations have been put in place to keep humanity from doing what it does best and most joyfully: foraging! So if you're wondering, how did this happen? This doesn't make any sense. You are correct. It doesn't make any sense. These laws were systematically put into place as a way to control and disempower people of color and people living in rural communities. And many of these laws are still in place. To complicate things even more, these laws are often vague and open to interpretation or misinterpretation. This can leave punishment, which often comes in the form of a fine, up to the discretion of local law enforcement. So it's a good idea to be familiar with laws and guidelines concerning foraging in public places such as parks and forests. To figure out what these regulations are for your particular area, do a little Google or ring up your local Parks and Rec to see what's up. So now that we have our foraging location scouted, and if it's a public place we're familiar with the regulations, let's move on to number 3, learning some plants and mushrooms. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, the most important guideline when learning a new species that you're going to eat is verify. Verify with 3 reputable sources before consuming it. You don't want any unscrupulous specimen sliding through the net of your ID like some kind of slippery eel. So triple check your ID. Now that we've got that guideline out of the way, let's explore my recommended path for learning about edible plants and mushrooms. Now this may sound counterintuitive, but the first step is learning about deadly poisonous species that grow in your area. This is not to freak you out, but I'm gonna rip the band-aid right off of your eyes. There are plants and mushrooms out there that will kill you, and you need to be certain that you can avoid them. So learn the poisonous ones, they're in the field guides too. Now that you've learned what not to eat, it's time to get to the fun part. How to learn what to eat. Probably the easiest way to learn how to forage is directly from another person. This is how knowledge was passed down literally forever, from person to person to person to person. And it tends to be the easiest way for people to learn this sort of thing. Now, in my opinion, the best way really is live and not some sort of online class, because if you're learning about living plants and mushrooms, it really is best to see them in their natural environment, to touch them and feel them and taste them. So pull out your friend list, see if anyone you know is into foraging, and ask them to show you one of their favorite plants that grows nearby. Now, if you don't happen to know any foragers that live nearby, do not fear. Let me tell you about this little thing known as the plant walk. Plant walks are great. You can find them through your local nature centers, sometimes at hippie festivals, or even find events that are listed in the Great online. Now, if you've never been to a plant walk before, you basically gather around some knowledgeable person and they'll tell you about maybe 15 to 20 species that you almost trampled on your way from the car. So your goal at this plant walk is going to be to learn one new species, just one. And you're going to learn it well. And once you learn this new plant, you're going to see it start popping up everywhere, following you home, creeping out behind your car. Now, if you really want to cement that new plant knowledge in, look it up in a book. Skitter on down to your local library, check out a local field guide, and read about that plant. That way, you can start dipping the toes of your brain into the sometimes very cold and vast pool of botany, just one plant at a time. And if you find out that you really love plant walks and you're really thirsting for more of this knowledge, do a little research and see if there are any structured foraging classes in your area. Sometimes these can be offered through your local nature centers. Sometimes they're called naturalist programs, but sometimes you can also find foraging specific instruction, although it can be a bit pricey. Which brings me to another branch of the Choose Your Own Adventure, the book branch. Now, if you are a meticulous person who is not easily misled by their stomach, consider a little bit of the old self-teaching via books. There are some wonderful field guides out there, and even inspirational foraging books. Now, learning completely from books can be a bit of a challenge. It is much easier to learn from a live person, but learning solely from books can be done. Just mosey on down to your local library, grab a couple of field guides, and get reading. Now, if it's available to you, used plant and mushroom field guides can be an indispensable resource to add to your library. Which brings me back to my main point of verification of ID. This is especially important if you're just learning from books and if you're teaching yourself. You must verify the ID of any new plant before you consume it in 3 verifiable sources. And I'm sorry, I don't make the rules, but the internet does not count as a reputable source. The internet is wonderful in many ways. There are many wonderful groups on Facebook and the like where you can get tentative IDs of things, but that does not count as a reputable source. It's great for inspiration, it's great for directions to look in, but for reputable sources, you're going to need to look in some actual books that were printed and have publishers behind them, at least at this point in time. Which brings me to our last step, number 4, get harvesting. I strongly advocate only harvesting abundant and invasive plants. Now, this is going to look like weeds and oftentimes tree products such as berries, tree leaves, or even nuts. If you focus on these 2 groups, over-harvesting is going to be less of an issue, and in some cases, you're actually helping the environment by pulling up noxious weeds that are crowding out other native plants. That being said, unless you are certain that what you're harvesting is a noxious weed or is very abundant, you need to leave the majority of that patch alone. Only harvest a small portion of that patch. You need to leave plenty behind for reproductive purposes, and for all the other critters that enjoy eating those plants as well. That way you and all the other critters can harvest from the area not just once, which is what will happen if you completely wipe up an area, but you can harvest there for many years to come. Foraging should be sustainable and not destructive. So there we have it. Now that you have those steps laid out before you, it's time to choose your own adventure and get started foraging. Now if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as I'll be putting out more flavorful foraging content featuring abundant and invasive plants in the coming weeks. Thanks for tuning in, and happy foraging!